"This won't change anything." The words, spoken by Thomas Blackwood, were as hard and unforgiving as the packed dirt floor of their ranch house. They hung in the air above the table, thick with the alien, yet deeply comforting, aroma of star anise and slow-braised beef. For three men who had eaten nothing but scorched bacon and stale bread for a year, the meal Wei had placed before them was a miracle. For the woman in the simple grey cheongsam who had travelled 6,000 miles to stand in this dusty kitchen, his words were a declaration of war, or worse, of utter futility. That single meal, served on chipped enamel plates in the dying light of a Wyoming summer, was the first stone tossed into the stagnant pool of their grief. It was the beginning of everything. The ripples from it would either save them or shatter the last, fragile pieces of the Blackwood legacy. Nobody was ready for what came next, least of all the man who had spoken those hopeless words. It had all started with a letter, and Samuel's foolish, desperate hope. Wei stepped from the train into a blast of heat that felt like a physical blow. The air tasted of dust and distance. On the platform stood three men, stark silhouettes against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. They were a study in contrasts, a fractured reflection of a single family. The youngest, Samuel, rushed forward, his face an open book of anxiety and welcome. He was barely a man, with kind eyes and a nervous habit of twisting the brim of his hat. Beside him stood Owen, arms crossed, his expression a thundercloud of resentment. His hostility was a shield, sharp and ready. And then there was the third. Thomas. He was the eldest, built with the solid, unyielding strength of the mountains that loomed on the horizon. His shoulders were as wide as a barn door, and his face was a mask carved from granite, all hard plains and shadowed hollows where grief had settled in to stay. He did not move, did not offer a hand or a word of greeting. He simply watched her, his gaze heavy with the weight of 100 unspoken burdens, his disapproval a palpable force. Wei met his stare, her own expression calm, revealing nothing of the fear that fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. She clutched the small, worn wooden box that held all she owned, its familiar weight the only anchor in this vast, terrifying new world. She had run from the ghosts of San Francisco, only to find herself facing a man who was haunted by his own. The ride to the ranch they called Barren Creek was a long, rattling journey into silence. Samuel tried to fill the void with cheerful observations about the land, his words drying up under the immense, indifferent sky and the stony quiet from his brothers. Owen stared pointedly out the other side of the wagon, as if her very presence were an offense. Thomas held the reins, his knuckles white, his attention fixed on the horizon as if he could will the ranch, and this ordeal, to be over. Wei said nothing. She watched the landscape unfurl, a tapestry of parched ochre and pale sagebrush, brutal in its beauty. It was a land that demanded resilience, that stripped away all that was unnecessary. She understood that. She had been stripped down to her very core, left with nothing but a set of skills and a will to survive that was as fierce and quiet as the heat shimmering off the distant mesas. The ranch, when they finally arrived, was a testament to a slow surrender. The main house sagged, its porch listing like a ship taking on water. Fences were down, and the corral stood empty and silent. A deep and profound neglect hung over the place, the physical manifestation of the sorrow that had taken root since the death of the family's matriarch a year prior. Samuel led her inside, his apologies a constant murmur. The air in the house was stale, thick with dust and the ghosts of better days. The kitchen, he showed her with a sweep of his hand, was her domain. It was a dark, grim space. A film of greasy dust covered every surface, and the meager contents of the pantry spoke of desperation, a half-empty sack of flour, some dried beans, a slab of salt pork. But for Wei, this forgotten room was not a challenge, it was a canvas. Here, in the heart of their decay, she could create. She could impose order. She could build a new life, one spoonful at a time. That night, she lay on a narrow cot in a small, bare room, listening to the house settle around her. She heard the low, tense murmur of the brothers' voices from the main room, the anger in Owen's tone, the placating notes of Samuel's, and beneath it all, the deep, rumbling silence of Thomas. She was an invader here, an unwelcome complication in their carefully managed misery. Her first full day at Barren Creek was steeped in an oppressive quiet. The brothers had risen before dawn, their movements heavy and joyless, and had ridden out without a word, leaving her alone in the hollow shell of their home. The silence they left behind was not peaceful, it was loud with unspoken things, with the echoes of laughter that no longer rang through the halls. And Wei did not allow herself to feel the loneliness that clawed at the edges of her resolve. Instead, she tied her hair back, donned a simple apron over her grey dress, and entered the kitchen. It was here she would make her stand. She worked for hours, a methodical whirlwind of quiet energy. She scrubbed the grime from the floorboards, polished the soot-stained stove until it gleamed a dull black, and washed every plate and cup. As she worked, she inventoried her battlefield. The supplies were worse than she had first thought. But necessity had long been her closest companion. In a corner, she found a small, dusty box filled with handwritten recipe cards, the ink faded, the edges softened with use. She touched them gently. These were the ghost of the woman whose place she was now meant to fill, the heart of the home that had stopped beating. And Wei closed the box. She would not try to replicate what was lost. She would create something new. She had carried her own arsenal across the ocean and the continent, a small, tightly wrapped silk packet containing a precious blend of spices, star anise, cinnamon bark, dried ginger, and Sichuan peppercorns that hummed with a latent fire. These were the flavors of her past, and they would be the foundation of her future. She found a tough, sinewy cut of beef in the meat safe, vegetables that were slightly withered but still held life, and from the parched earth near the well, she gathered a handful of wild onions whose sharp scent reminded her of home. The work centered her. The rhythmic chop of the knife on the worn wooden board, the precise measuring of her spices, the patient browning of the meat, each action was a prayer, a meditation. Soon, a fragrance began to fill the kitchen, a scent utterly alien to this place. It was rich, complex, and deeply savory, a tendril of warmth and promise that crept from the kitchen, through the silent house, and out into the vast, empty landscape. It was the smell of hope, simmering slowly on the stove. The three brothers returned as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and purple. They were caked in dust, their shoulders slumped with the bone-deep weariness of men who worked from dawn to dusk for little more than survival. But as they approached the house, they slowed. Owen was the first to stop, lifting his head like a hound catching a scent on the wind. Samuel's tired face broke into a look of cautious wonder. Thomas reined in his horse, his expression unreadable, but his nostrils flared, taking in the aroma that now saturated the air. It was a smell that promised something other than sustenance, it promised care. They entered the house not in their usual stomping silence, but with a strange, almost reverent hesitation. The table was set. The chipped enamel plates were clean, the tin cutlery aligned. In the center of the table, steam rose from a large earthenware bowl. And Wei stood by the stove, her face impassive, her hands clasped before her. She moved with a quiet grace, filling their plates with a stew so dark and rich it seemed to absorb the fading light. Saturday. The silence at the table was different now. It was not empty, but full of tension, curiosity, and a deep, primal response to the offering before them. Samuel picked up his fork immediately, his eagerness a bright spark in the gloom. Owen eyed his plate with suspicion, as if expecting the foreign food to betray him. Thomas simply stared at the chunks of tender beef, the glistening carrots, and the strange, star-shaped pods floating in the glossy sauce. He lifted his fork slowly, deliberately. The first bite was a detonation of flavor. The beef, which should have been tough as leather, melted on his tongue. The sauce was a symphony of tastes he had no names for, sweet, savory, warmly spiced, with a faint, tingling heat that woke up his senses. It was complex and comforting, ancient and entirely new. He saw the shock register on Owen's face, saw Samuel close his eyes in pure bliss. For a moment, the granite mask on his own face cracked. This was not merely food. It was a craft, an art. It was a profound act of creation in a place where everything seemed to be slowly falling apart. He took another bite, and another. He ate until his plate was clean, until the warmth of the stew had settled deep in his belly, a small, glowing coal against the pervasive chill of his grief. It was only then, after the last bite was gone and the spell was broken, that he looked at Wei and uttered the words that would define the start of their journey. "This won't change anything," but his voice, for the first time in a year, held a tremor of doubt. In the days that followed, the echo of Thomas's words hung in the kitchen, a challenge Wei met with quiet diligence. The meal had changed something, whether he would admit it or not. The thick shroud of misery over the ranch had been pierced by a single beam of light. The brothers still ate in near silence, but it was a silence now punctuated by the scrape of forks against plates wiped clean, a sound that was its own form of praise. Owen, who had been the most openly hostile, began to leave small offerings on the kitchen porch in the mornings, a pail of fresh milk, a basket of just-picked beans from the struggling vegetable patch, without a word of explanation. They were peace offerings, grudging admissions of defeat from a man who communicated better with actions than with words. Samuel, however, was effusive. One evening, as Wei washed the dishes, he lingered by the door, twisting his hat in his hands. "I wanted to thank you," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "Properly. That meal, it was the first time this place has felt like a home since Ma died." His voice cracked on the last words, and the raw grief in them struck Wei with surprising force. She simply nodded, her hand still in the warm, soapy water, granting him the dignity of her silence. It was Samuel who first hinted at the true depth of their troubles. He spoke of the bank in town, of letters that went unanswered, of a looming debt that felt as insurmountable as the mountains. He mentioned a name, Franklin Croft, a neighboring rancher who was buying up land with a relentless, predatory hunger. "He wants our water," Samuel said, his voice low. "Barren Creek is the only thing that runs year-round in this valley. Without it, our land is worthless. And with it, his is a kingdom." The threat was no longer just the internal decay of grief but an external force, circling like a vulture. Wei listened, drying a plate with meticulous care. She was a stranger here, a woman purchased through a catalogue, but their fight was rapidly becoming her own. Her own survival was now inextricably linked to the survival of this broken family and their parched piece of land. She had not come here for a battle, but she would not shrink from one. Her kitchen was becoming more than a place to cook, it was becoming a command post, a sanctuary where she could gather her strength and forge her own kind of weapons. Weeks bled into a month, and a fragile rhythm established itself at Barren Creek. The days were governed by the sun and the seasons of the ranch, but the evenings were governed by Wei's kitchen. Her meals became the anchor of their lives, the one constant in a world of uncertainty. She learned the landscape of their hunger, the deep, unspoken needs that food could begin to soothe. For Samuel's youthful energy, she made savory noodle dishes. For Owen's simmering anger, she cooked slow-roasted meats that required patience and strength to prepare. And for Thomas, for the profound, cavernous grief he carried, she made rich, nourishing broths and soups that warmed from the inside out, a quiet assault on the fortress he had built around his heart. She began to resurrect the dead garden behind the house, coaxing life from the dry, compacted soil. She found an unlikely ally in Gus, the ranch's only hired hand, an old man with skin like tanned leather and eyes that had seen too many winters. He said little, but he saw everything. He watched her work, her small frame moving with an efficiency that belied her strength. One afternoon, as they knelt in the dirt, planting seeds she had carefully saved, he finally spoke of the family he had served for 30 years. "The missus, she was the glue," he said, not looking at her. "When she passed, the boys just came apart." Owen got angry, Sam got scared, and Thomas, he just shut the door. Built a wall around his heart so high, he can't even see over it himself. Gus showed her which native herbs were edible, which roots held water, and shared the law of the land. He treated her not as a mail-order bride, but as a fellow survivor. He recognized the steel in her. Through him, Wei began to understand the geography of their pain, the history that had shaped the 3 men she now lived with. Her understanding deepened her resolve. This was no longer just about her own survival. It was about theirs. The meals became more ambitious, the flavors more complex, a quiet testament to her growing confidence. And slowly, imperceptibly, the house began to change. The scent of ginger and garlic permanently replaced the smell of dust and decay. The sound of a knife on a cutting board became the home's new heartbeat. The wall around Thomas's heart remained, but Nwei's cooking was like a persistent, gentle rain, slowly wearing away at the stone. The breaking point arrived with the male rider, a thin, dust-caked man who delivered a crisp white envelope that felt heavier than it should. It was from the bank. Thomas read it standing on the porch, his face growing harder, more desolate, with each line. The note was an ultimatum: payment in full within 30 days, or the foreclosure proceedings would begin. Barren Creek, the legacy his father had carved from this unforgiving land, would be sold on the courthouse steps. The news fell like an axe, severing the fragile threads of hope that had begun to weave themselves through the household. That night, the dinner Nwei had carefully prepared sat untouched. The silence was back, but now it was jagged, filled with the sharp edges of panic and despair. Thomas finally exploded, his frustration a raw, wounded roar. He slammed his hand on the table, making the plates jump. His fury, unable to strike at the bank or at fate itself, found the nearest target. "This was your brilliant idea, Samuel," he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "Bringing her here. Wasting money we didn't have. We needed another hand, not another mouth to feed." The accusation, brutal and unfair, struck Nwei harder than a physical blow. She saw Samuel flinch, his face crumbling. She saw Owen look away, ashamed. For a moment, she felt the old impulse to retreat, to become small and invisible. But then, a different instinct took over, a cold, clear anger. She had worked tirelessly to bring a semblance of life back to this house, to nourish these broken men, only to be dismissed as a burden. She rose from the table, her movements deliberate, and went to the small desk where she kept her accounts. She returned and placed a worn ledger on the table in front of Thomas. "Look at it," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority he had never heard before. He stared at her, then down at the book. Inside, in neat, precise columns, she had documented every cent spent, every resource used. She had tracked the cost of flour, of salt, of the few supplies they bought in town. And on the final page, she had drawn a comparison: the cost of the haphazard, wasteful way they had been living versus the frugal, careful management she had implemented. The numbers were stark. She had not been another mouth to feed, she had saved them a significant amount of money. Thomas stared at the pages, the fury draining from his face, replaced by a stunned disbelief. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a fragile woman or a household expense, but as an intelligent, capable strategist. The confrontation hung in the air, electric and transformative. He finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. There was no apology, but there was a flicker of something new: respect. "My father," he said, his voice rough and low, "he built this place from nothing. I can't be the one to lose it." And Nwei held his gaze, her own anger softening into a shared resolve. "Then we will not lose it," she replied. The word we'd settled between them, a fragile, powerful bridge across the chasm of their differences. Franklin Croft arrived 2 days later, a serpent in a tailored suit. He rode a fine black horse that looked out of place against the dusty backdrop of Barren Creek, and his smile was a practiced, predatory thing. He dismounted with an air of casual ownership, his eye sweeping over the neglected ranch with a connoisseur's disdain. Thomas met him on the porch, standing as solid and immovable as an old oak. Croft offered a hand, which Thomas ignored. "Thomas, my boy," Croft began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I heard about your troubles with the bank. A pity. Your father was a good man, but this land, it requires a firm hand." He let the insult hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I'm here as a friend. To make you an offer. I'll take the place off your hands. Pay off your debt. It's more than you'll get at auction. Save yourselves the public embarrassment." The offer was an act of aggression disguised as charity, a lowball price that was an insult to his father's memory. Pride, hot and fierce, surged through Thomas. "The ranch is not for sale," he said, his voice a low growl. Croft's smile never faltered. "Think it over. A man has to know when he's beaten." As he turned to leave, he paused. "By the way, I've secured the water rights to the upper fork of the creek. Just a formality, you understand." Best to have these things in order. The veiled threat was a dagger. Without access to the upper fork, their creek would run dry by late summer, rendering the entire ranch worthless. Croft mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of doom in his wake. That night, the mood at the dinner table was not one of despair, but of a quiet, simmering fury. Croft's arrogance had done what months of hardship could not. It had united them against a common enemy. They were cornered, their backs against the wall. It was into this tense, charged atmosphere that Wei spoke. "The town summer fair," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "It is in 3 weeks." The brothers looked at her, confused. "People come from all over the county," she continued, her idea taking shape as she spoke. "They spend money. What if we sold food?" "My food." The suggestion was so radical, so audacious, that it stunned them into silence. Selling strange, foreign food from a stall at the county fair? It was madness. Samuel's eyes lit up first, seeing the desperate brilliance of it. Owen's skepticism was written all over his face, but he didn't dismiss it outright. He was ready to fight, and this was a plan, however strange. All eyes turned to Thomas. He looked at Wei, at the fierce determination in her dark eyes, the unshakable belief she had in her own abilities. It was a wild gamble, a shot in the dark against an impossible foe. But it was better than sitting here, waiting for the end. "All right," he said, the word coming out like a piece of rusted metal. "We'll do it." The following 3 weeks were a blur of frantic, purposeful labor. The ranch, so long dormant under its blanket of grief, hummed with a new energy. A sense of shared purpose, sharp and invigorating, replaced the listless despair. For the first time, the Blackwood brothers worked not as 3 separate, wounded individuals, but as a cohesive unit. Owen, his anger channeled into creation, built a sturdy stall from salvaged lumber, his hammer blows echoing through the yard with a defiant rhythm. Samuel, his hope given an outlet, meticulously painted a sign that read "The Silk Road Kitchen," a name he'd come up with that made Wei smile for the first time. Gus, the wise elder, became her trusted quartermaster, helping her calculate the vast quantities of ingredients they would need and bartering shrewdly for supplies in town. The kitchen became the heart of the operation, a fragrant, steamy hub of activity. Thomas found himself drawn there, ostensibly to help with heavy lifting, but really to watch Wei work. He saw the way she moved, a dance of precision and grace, her hands transforming simple ingredients into something extraordinary. In the quiet hours of the evening, as they worked side by side shelling beans or chopping vegetables, they began to talk. He learned of the family she had lost to famine, of the treacherous journey to a new country, and of the dangers in San Francisco that had forced her to flee and answer Samuel's desperate advertisement. He saw the immense strength and sorrow she carried beneath her serene exterior, and he recognized a fellow soul who had walled off their pain to survive. He found himself telling her about his mother, about her laughter and the way she used to hum in the kitchen, memories he hadn't allowed himself to visit in over a year. A fragile, unspoken intimacy grew between them, forged in the heat of the stove and the shared vulnerability of their desperate venture. The day of the fair dawned brutally hot. Their humble stall, tucked between a boisterous pie seller and a grim-faced purveyor of leather goods, looked small and out of place. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, dust, and fried dough. As people began to wander the fairgrounds, they would slow as they passed the Silk Road Kitchen, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion at the strange, enticing aromas. Wei, looking elegant and composed in her grey cheongsam, stood ready. The brothers flanked her, a nervous, protective wall. They saw Franklin Croft, holding court near the judge's stand, a smug, knowing look on his face as he watched their pathetic little enterprise. The first hour crawled by. A few people stopped, sniffed, and moved on. A knot of dread tightened in Thomas's stomach. This was a mistake. They were going to be a laughingstock. Just as despair began to set in, a young couple, emboldened by curiosity, cautiously approached the stall. They purchased a small bowl of her braised beef and noodles, retreating to a nearby bench to eat it. Wei and the brothers watched, holding their breath. The woman took a bite, her eyes widening in surprise. She nudged her husband, who took a bite of his own and let out a low whistle of appreciation. They finished the bowl in minutes and came back for another. That small act of courage broke the dam. A few more people, their curiosity piqued, decided to try the exotic food. The reaction was electric. Word spread through the fairgrounds like a grass fire. "Have you tried the food at that new stall? It's like nothing I've ever tasted." Soon, a trickle of customers became a steady stream, and the stream became a line that snaked out from their stall and into the main thoroughfare. The four of them became a blur of motion. And Wei commanded the kitchen, her movements fluid and economical, never wasting a step as she cooked batch after batch. Samuel took the money, his initial nervousness replaced by a confident grin. Owen, his scowl gone, served up the steaming bowls with a surprising gentleness. Thomas stood guard, his imposing presence keeping the line orderly, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd, a silent protector. He watched and Wei, a fierce pride swelling in his chest. She was magnificent. She was a general commanding a battle, and she was winning. He saw Franklin Croft staring at their bustling stall, his smug confidence curdling into a look of pure, unadulterated fury. Croft had expected them to fail, to crumble. He had underestimated them, and most of all, he had underestimated the quiet, resilient woman in the grey cheongsam. By late afternoon, they were completely sold out. Every last noodle, every drop of savory broth, was gone. They hung the reclosed sign to the groans of the disappointed crowd. Exhausted, splattered with sauce, and drenched in sweat, they leaned against the counter of their stall, a shared, giddy sense of disbelief washing over them. That night, back at Barren Creek, they sat around the kitchen table and counted the money. The pile of bills and coins grew into a small mountain. It was more than they had dared to hope for. It was enough. Enough to pay the bank. Enough to buy seed for the spring planting. Enough to survive. The weight of a year of despair lifted from the room, replaced by a light, almost dizzying elation. Later, Thomas found Wei standing on the porch, gazing up at the sea of stars that glittered in the vast, dark sky. The high collar of her dress was unbuttoned, and a gentle breeze stirred the loose strands of her hair. He came to stand beside her, the silence between them comfortable, full of everything they had accomplished together. He searched for the right words, for a way to express the profound gratitude and admiration he felt, but language failed him. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused, rough fingers closing around hers. She didn't pull away. "You didn't just cook a meal, Wei," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. "You didn't just save this ranch. You brought us back to life." She turned to him, her eyes shining in the starlight, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The solid strength of him was an anchor. She had stopped running. She was home.